Everyone, thank you for taking the time to come and listen. We're going to be getting into Revelation chapter 6. Sorry it's taken so long to get around to it, but we are ready to rock and roll. So, verse 1 says, As I watched, the Lamb broke the first of the seven seals on the scroll. Then I heard one of the four living beings say, with a voice like thunder, Come. Obviously, my voice was not very thunderous when I said that, but I don't know how to do that. So, this is getting into the actual revelations that are given. So everything up to this point has basically been an introduction of sorts. It's been setting the stage, talking about where people are at, where the world is at, kind of giving some warnings and some encouragements. But this is actually getting into the symbols. And we're going to start seeing we're about to start seeing the mysteries that are contained in the scroll. And this is where the action really begins, and we start getting into the things that are to come. Verse 2 says, I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown. And he rode out as a conqueror, bent on conquest. So what I noticed first is that there's an interesting relationship between what this rider is doing and what it's announcing. He's riding out to conquer, but he's already wearing the crown of a conqueror. So throughout most of history, horses were used in warfare as a quick means of transportation. They were something that gave an edge to an army with a strong cavalry. And if you imagine the image of a white horse and a rider moving across the earth, there's also an interesting parallel between that image and that of the white dove that flies out over the waters of the flood. And that, of course, is symbolic of the Holy Spirit. So now you have a very similar image being played out here, and it's something that is advancing, but it's already victorious. It's pure, it's energetic, it's quick, and it's powerful. Just as the Spirit hovers over the waters in the beginning, this horse and rider go out first as well. And you can see this as the Spirit working in our lives and in the life of the church itself. Matthew 11:12 talks about forcefully advancing the kingdom. And in that passage, Jesus points to the value of taking action and of being willing to answer the call. Those who are eager for victory, those who are willing to stand firm until the end and to fight back, not to stay stagnant, not to stay complacent, not to just kind of let it happen to them, but they're willing to lay hold of it. They're willing to be decisive and to take action. Verse 3, when the Lamb broke the second seal, I heard the second living being saying, Come. So the second beast is that of the ox. And the fact that John is being called between them sounds like to me that the image of the scroll is quite large. He has to travel between the seals. Verse 4 says, Then another rider appeared, a red one. Its rider was given a mighty sword and the authority to take peace from the earth. And there was war and slaughter everywhere. So the second rider announces the introduction of conflict. This war is both in the life of the church and also within our own psyche. If the white horse represents peace and the arrival of the Holy Spirit in our hearts, then we can expect that a spiritual battle is soon to follow. Jesus says, I have come not to bring peace, but a sword. That's Matthew 10:34. And if the world is in opposition to God, then the more closely we walk with God, the more at odds we're going to be with the rulers of earth. Not only is there a physical war against the church, but also a spiritual war that is being waged against every single one of us. And when things start to go crazy, we shouldn't be afraid or wonder if we've been abandoned. Jesus told us that these things are going to happen. And he said this in advance so that we could hold on to the promise of salvation, despite how we may feel in our day-to-day tragedies. And remember, when you really do commit to following God, you're going to be attacked. You're going to have, because I mean, that's like you're an influential figure at that point. You become dangerous to the devil. You become dangerous because you are advancing the kingdom. So when you commit to that, you can expect that things are going to get hard. Bad stuff is going to happen to you. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be strife. There's going to be pain and misery and all other sorts of things. So don't get discouraged by that. It's something that has to happen. Verse 5 says, When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, Come. I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. So the black horse is an image of fear, famine, and calamity. And while it's not the rider of death itself, it is the precursor to death. So scales are used to determine the worth or the measure of something. When fear and calamity strike, our faith is tested, and we learn whether or not it stacks up against the hardships of life. We learn the value of our faith. We learn the measure of our faith. It shows that the difficulties which are to come are measured out carefully and intentionally. The things that are happening to us, they're not random. God has planned this very intentionally. It's very measured. And although it can be hard to understand how God could allow certain things to happen, there is in fact a purpose behind it all. So the writer can also be seen as bringing famine during times of scarcity. You're forced to carefully measure and ration out your daily consumption. And again, the next writer is death, and the previous was conflict and war. So this is kind of the intermediary. The scales are often used to represent justice because they demonstrate fairness and balance. This points to how we live under the law, and without the redemption of Christ, we are judged according to our works. What we have in a spiritual sense then is that the pressures of our fleshly nature wage war against our spirit, and we're unable to conquer that in our own strength. And from a place of spiritual famine and deprivation, we are judged under the law according to what we deserve. The wages of sin is death, and this is a good reminder that our actions do have real consequences. God created a world of cause and effect, a world of order. There's consequences to what we do, and it can be easy to feel like we're getting away with things because we don't have to pay the price immediately. And this is why the wicked seem to prosper, and why allowing the enemy to gain even a small foothold can spiral out very quickly. If the consequences were immediate and painful, we wouldn't be so persistent with sin. But unfortunately, it can sometimes be years and years before the compound results of our actions become evident, because those play out in our character and the patterns of our lives. Verse 6 says, "And I heard a voice from among the four living beings saying, a loaf of wheat bread, or 3 loaves of barley will cost a day's pay, and don't waste the olive oil and wine." So this seems to be alluding again to the idea of famine. Things are expensive. There's inflation and resources are scarce. So be careful. Don't waste anything. Verse 7, when the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." Verse 8, I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Some translations say a pale green horse, and also instead of Hades, it says hell or the grave. And what's interesting is that the verse doesn't seem to necessarily be it doesn't seem to necessarily be referring to hell as a place of punishment so much as just the dwelling place of the forces of death, which are being unleashed upon the earth. Not to negate the physical reality, of course, but this also kind of points to the spiritual death as well. The gates of death are opened, and many people live as if they were already dead. So it's not even just that they're physically dying, it's that, a fourth of the earth is just, they're spiritually dead. They go through their lives, but they're not alive. The corruption of the flesh means that we are constantly either growing or decaying. So those who neglect their spiritual growth are unable to hold on to their current states of being, and they sort of fall into decay, right? If you're, what is the phrase? If stagnant water becomes disgusting or whatever it is. But it's like you have to be moving in one direction or another. You can't just rest. You can't be complacent. If you're not committing to your spiritual growth, that means that if you're not moving forward, you're moving backwards, right? I think that there's something of that in here. And death is also the obvious result of war and famine. God created a universe, like I said, of cause and effect, and it's just in its operations. If you engage in destructive behaviors, you're going to end up destroying yourself. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. If you indulge in the warmth of the fires of earthly passion, you're going to end up burning yourself. Like that pleasure eventually turns to pain. In other words, you're going to reap what you sow. Verse 9 says, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who have been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. So this seal describes the issue with, or an issue with the church itself rather than the world. It's not pointing just to everybody, it's pointing specifically to the church and the martyrs. Verse 10, they called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Verse 11, then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. So the white robes are a symbol of their sanctification. It's a token of the glory which covers them. And remember in Genesis, when Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, rather than live up to the potential of divinity that God imparted to them by breathing life directly into them, they gave into the desires of their animal nature. And acting like an animal caused them to become more and more like the beasts of the field. So the garments of skin that they covered themselves in pointed to the fact that what covered their lives was of a bestial nature. So here we see that reverse. By walking in Jesus's footsteps, the martyrs are instead covered in glory and purity. Verses 12 through 13. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. I have a hard time with that word. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, and the whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to the earth, as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. So when you're looking at symbolism, it's important to reference other places where that same symbol has been used. And in this case, the darkening of the sun also took place in Exodus and also during the crucifixion. So, of course, there's already some parallels there between the lives of Moses and Jesus, but here we seem to have the fulfillment of whatever that pattern is. Isaiah and Joel both also made several references to this passage in their prophecies. The moon turning to blood, to me at least, it seems to imply that this whole thing is very symbolic, and maybe it's literally going to happen as well. But for the day-to-day application, like, how does this affect us today? What does this matter for us right now? Because everybody likes to say we're in end times, but what if we're not? Right? And the early church certainly wasn't. So why is this being sent out to all believers? Is it just for that last little segment of people that are going to experience this? Because we don't know when that's going to be, right? Is this just so that we can interpret when end times are? Because Christ says when it gets to that point, like, don't listen to people saying, no, this is end times, or this is the Messiah. He's out here, he's over there. It's going to be so evident. It's going to be obvious, right? And so partially it's to encourage us to hold on, to stand firm as everything's falling apart, and the sun's disappearing and the moon's turning to blood, and we're about to get into some even worse stuff here in a second. But yeah, like, it's part of it is that encouragement, right? Like, just hold on. Like, God's saying, I've still got this. But there's also spiritual implications, because if it was written to the early church, but it's written for all believers, because we deal with these patterns, we deal with these challenges on a day-to-day basis. They're in the world around us, they're inside of us, they're in our consciousness. And I think that meditating on the spiritual implications of this scene in particular is going to bear a lot of fruit, especially as this pattern is rehearsed again and again and again before it, of course, comes to fruition in the final fulfillment, whatever that looks like. So as far as the blood moon goes, and I could be completely wrong here. Like, this is my interpretation of it. I want to point that out. This is what I got from this. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is useful, but it's not 100% correct. Maybe it's not the intention. Maybe I'm right. Who knows? I don't know, but it's something to think about. The moon marks seasons and the passages of time, and its gravitational pull has an effect on the tides, right? Like, that's why the tides rise and falls, because of the gravitational pull of the moon. Our bodies are mostly water, right? So by extension, the moon also has a physical effect on our bodies. When I worked at as a bouncer nightclubs, I was very aware of the fact, and I think that most people that work security or law enforcement, they know that, like, full moon brings weird stuff. Like, it just does. Like, it's a weird energy. We don't really understand it. But also too, yeah, we'll get into that. But it influences the waters, and it also has symbolic implications in terms of the unconscious and in terms of emotional effects as well. So, how do I say this? Well, we talked a little bit already. I think it was the last episode about how the water is a symbol of the unconscious and the emotions, and we'll see later on too. This is where we kind of touched on it, where the beast and the prostitute have that relationship with the waters, and I think that there's a spiritual component to like everything that's in the physical reality. Like there's that's a lower reflection of something of some higher truth, right? And whatever that gravitational pull is on our physical bodies and on physically on the water, I think that there's also a spiritual and metaphoric symbolic implication of like there's something happening at a higher level as well that interacts with our spiritual matter, whatever that is. But for right now, we're talking about the moon specifically. We won't get it too much into the other stuff, but if you look at that, if you look at how the moon relates to the emotional body and the unconscious, and it symbolizes the unconscious, and then you imagine that it becomes soaked with blood, you get some pretty interesting ideas in that context. You see how the war of our world is actually a direct attack on the unconscious, on the emotions. The bloodshed can also be of an emotional and psychological nature. So, our great spiritual war is one that's filled with subliminal messages. It's filled with media, it's filled with fear porn and the incitement of rage, right? Indignation, virtue signaling, sympathy. It's all in this effort to manipulate and control us, right? Look at the news, look at social media, look at music, TV, etc. They all engage our emotional responses and they affect our unconscious programming. And it's all in an attempt to captivate, subjugate, and monetize our attention and to rouse us to action, right? Because when you can engage somebody's emotions, you can manipulate them, you can influence them, you can direct their attention wherever you want, and you can also cause them to make certain decisions. And if you guys listen to my other podcast, that's what I'm about to do an episode on that as well, and like how your emotional state has a huge impact on the way that you think. And so over the course of days, hours, even like minute to minute, but especially over long stretches of time, you're many different people, right? Even in the course of a month, like you're many different people because you make decisions differently depending on how you feel. And so as you cycle through a wide range of emotions, it's like, well, I made this decision. I don't understand why I can't carry it out. I don't understand why I can't stay committed to this thing. It's like I really wanted to do XYZ, but then my mood changed and it's like I really don't want to anymore. Or I still want to, but I really don't think that I can. It's like, what's going on there? Well, there's this war against our spirit, but also against our fleshly nature. And it's a war for our time, again, passages of time, the moon. It's a war against our perception. And that's, again, both in terms of human physical war. So, in terms of like the media, in terms of politicians, in terms of just human endeavors, and also in spiritual warfare, demonic forces, and stuff like that. And this is like, where does one end and the other begin? It's really impossible to say. It's all too closely interwoven. It's just too jumbled up, right? So somebody may be trying to get famous on social media, for example, and they want to make a certain type of post, and they realize, hey, if I'm really loud and inflammatory, and I'm controversial, and like, well, hey, I get attention, and that works, right? And so they may not be consciously saying, I want to poison the mindset of people. Like you look at certain shows out there. I think the easiest one is there's a lot of podcasts these days on, we can call them podcasts, but there's a lot of shows these days on like dating, both on both sides of the table, and they tend to be very polarizing, right? They tend to have really negative views about the opposite gender, whatever that is. So it's like if it's targeted towards men, then it's talking about how women are crazy, delusional, and whatever else, and they're just not good people. And if it's for women targeted against men, it's kind of the same thing, but it plays on the things that women find obnoxious about men, or the things that they have been hurt from. So like men don't care about them, and they should just be taken advantage of, and all this other stuff. And it's like those people probably aren't thinking consciously, I want to tear everyone apart. I want to divide people. I want to create a world where, the devil is worshiped because, we're doing away with the order that God has established. They're not thinking that, more than likely. They're thinking, oh, this gets me attention, which makes me money and makes me feel good about myself. It gets me things. So I'm gonna do that. And they're not consciously thinking I want to reprogram people, but they just kind of stumbled onto this way of, getting what they want. But at the same time, that's a tool of spiritual warfare. That's something that Satan can use to influence people, and the demonic forces are at play there. And you get involved in those sorts of that type of thinking, and it just kind of it feeds on itself, right? Like something takes over, and there's a spirit there. There's an energy that exacerbates things. It makes it really bad. It throws fuel on the fire, and the next thing you know, you have these crazy controversial shows where they're saying all kinds of wild stuff, right? And nobody thinks about it. Nobody bats an eye. It's like, oh yeah, that's just what it is, right? Because it's speaking to that. It resonates with a certain level of depravity and darkness that we all kind of struggle with. And so when it's just exemplified and also magnified out in the real world and other people are talking about it, it's like, oh yeah, that kind of, yeah, I can get that, right? And you get sucked into it because it plays off of your emotions. It plays off of your unconscious, but it also has the effect of, if you listen to that and engage in it and you think about it and you agree with it, like the more it's in your brain, the more it starts to change the way that you think. And it's subtle at first, but then it starts to become not so subtle, and it creates some issues. You become reprogrammed. It's a war on your emotions, and by extension on your unconscious mind. Okay. So the earthquake in this verse can obviously be a real earthquake, but it's also symbolic, right, of upheaval and things of that nature. So when you have lots of conflict, lots of drama, lots of destruction, etc., think about what an earthquake does physically to the land and how that can also happen in a fractal nature across different dimensions of experience. So, for example, the opening of rifts between people, the plates shift and opens up a huge crater, right? Well, it opens up a rift between people. There's a division of the land. There's the throwing down of human made structures. There's the shaking up of established organizations, so on and so forth. Ellicott makes the observation that the unripe figs in this verse, the unripe figs that are still on the tree when winter comes around, are a great metaphor for the person who has had all year to work and to bear fruit, but has missed the opportunity. And they now fall to the ground as waste. And I'd add also that if a particular branch has large amounts of waste on it, it may end up being pruned and thrown into the fire, which is a example that Jesus used. And I think that the collapse here also points to like the collapse of like the earth being shaken, but also the sun and the moon being kind of done away with, the stars falling to earth. There's like a total implosion of heaven and earth. So what was meant to be kept higher and up in the heavens is now profaned and blasphemed, right? What was supposed to be holy is now dragged through the dirt, while what was meant for the earth is elevated, it's worshipped, it's idolized. Those things are lifted up beyond their current place, and also what was supposed to be higher order, or of a higher order, that's now brought down. It's disgraced, and we can see that happening over and over and over again throughout the course of history in our daily lives within us as well as in our societies. There's a collapsing of structure and hierarchy that takes place. And remember that the devil's goal is to invert the perfection of God's creation. That's why he wants to separate man and woman. That's why he wants to break laws, to blaspheme the holy, to dirty the waters, to break boundaries between gender, for example, to separate families, to isolate people from one another. The building of structures that further drive us apart, physical and otherwise. The institutions, the like a city, you look at a city, how it divides, it brings people together, but it also divides them, right? Like you're very lonely living in a city sometimes because you're not really truly connected with people. You might live in a huge building with a ton of people, and you don't know any of them. There's no community there, right? But you probably have the same number of friends that you would if you lived in a small town. It doesn't like, but there's a lot of people there. It's weird. That kind of stuff serves to further divide us and so on and so forth. But on the positive side, God can also use this upside down backwardness for good. So when creation is worshipped, for example, I don't know, the sun and the moon, like, which is a huge, that's pretty persistent. Um, those are pretty persistent idols across pagan cultures. Like any worship of nature, the sun and the moon are usually very, very important in those religions. But when those things are worshiped, that's creation, and that goes against what God intended them for. So he wants us to appreciate the heavens, but when created things are elevated above their intended place, it obviously is no good. It leads us astray. We're fixated on the physical instead of on the transcendent. And so what you see also here is a casting down of idols, and an elevation of the lowly, right? It's the show of like, hey, God doesn't need you to be strong. He just needs you to obey. If you're in a lowly position, if you're weak and you can't do a whole lot, but you're willing to answer and do what he says, like he can elevate you. That's the shepherd who rises to kingship, or the savior born into a manger. And so when we see all of this destruction, this upheaval, and the casting down of all these high places, and all this turmoil, it's easy to feel afraid, like, oh no, there's going to be so much violence and so much chaos. And that's true. But remember that this is a positive thing that God is bringing about to make us anew, to revitalize us. It's the flood that destroys the old and the degenerate so that we can rebuild. And this is symbolized by the waters of baptism. Verse 14 says, the heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. So, the end of the chapter, we're turning the page, we're rolling up the scroll. It's an end of an age, all that stuff. The mountains, which seems so immovable, are now brought down, they're destroyed. And again, this can refer to the perceived mountains of human institutions, um, the things that we think will never change, the cycles of history, things that seem immovable and like set and high and elevated, cycles of history, the patterns of power, the attempts of man to reach upwards towards the heaven. That's all brought down. It's all leveled. The mountains and the islands are also the things that bring distinction to the landscape, right? Islands break up the waters and mountains oppose themselves upon the land. And the removal of these things possibly, at least, alludes to a return to something like the original creation, where the land and the sea were fully separated, along with the heavens and the earth. And the mountains are the thing that reach up to heaven and bring heaven and earth closer. And the islands are obviously what breaks up the waters. And so we're doing away with that. There's that reestablishment of order to return to the prototype. And whether that means literally the mountains are going to be flattened, or if it just means like it's symbolic, I have no idea. Again, it could be literal, but also just it's important, I think, to look at like what is the day-to-day application of this as well. What is the spiritual, psychological application of this? Verse, I think this is 15 through 17. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? So this is a continuation of high places being brought low. Everyone is humbled because from God's vantage point, we're all on the same level. Nobody escapes judgment. And God sees what you do in secrets, and he knows the motivations of your heart. Nothing is hidden from him. So thank you guys for listening. I appreciate your time. Hit me up on Instagram. I've got a page, Lamp of the Body, for this. If you want to follow me there, I'm trying to get that rolling. But yeah, I will see you soon. Good luck.